I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to the Matan podcast, and welcome to our Devarim series titled Torah from Our Teachers. Moshe is our greatest human teacher, and the book of Devarim includes his monumental addresses to the nation. For each week of this series, our guests will share with us Torah learned from their most influential teachers. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more info, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il, or you can contact the Matan office directly. Today, we will be exploring the fifth and final book of the Torah. The book of Devarim can be divided into three central speeches. One historical, chapters 1 through 4, one focused on the commandments, chapters 5 through 26, and the speech of the covenant, which is chapters 27 through 30. The final 4 chapters are Moshe's formal goodbye and the closing of the Torah. The first 30 chapters of Devarim contains in it significant repetition of earlier passages in the Torah, now told from Moshe's perspective. We have devoted several episodes in the past discussing the idea of the covenantal treaty. This must be mentioned again as we open Devarim, because without it, we simply miss the underlying thrust of the entire book. For a great summary of this idea, you can open up in Rabbi Sachs's introduction to the book of Devarim. It is important for me to mention that, Rabbi Sachs, as always, writes this clearly and so well for the broader audience. This is an idea that scholarship has been writing about for, I would say, the better part of the last century. There are many books devoted to covenant theology within Tanakh. But if you look there or anywhere else, we know that the book of Devarim, while you can also divide it up into the speeches I just mentioned, is really also organized exactly the way that these treaties used to be written. Now, these treaties were not between two equal powers. It was not an alliance, but it was a treaty between a powerful king and a weaker power. Okay, we, of course, are obviously the weaker power here. And these covenants begin with a preamble that established the identity of the person or power initiating the covenant. And then it was followed by a historical prologue, which reviews the history of the relationship between the two parties of the covenant. And that's what we see in the beginning of this week's Parsha, for example. Then came the provisions of the covenant itself, the stipulations, which are often stated in two forms, both general principles and detailed provisions, i.e. law. And then we have the sanctions associated with the covenant, meaning the blessings that would be bestowed upon those who followed it and adhered to the covenant, and the curses that would occur if it was broken. And lastly, there were the witnesses, the witness agreement, usually the gods of the nation. Of course, here it's heaven and earth that we see described also earlier in the book, but mostly in the last 4 chapters of the book of Devarim. And so, I'm sorry, I actually missed one there, which is that in the middle, we have provisions for the covenant to be deposited in a sacred place and read on a regular basis. And that, of course, we have in chapter 27 and 31, where the Torah will be inscribed on stone on Harei Val, and the Moshe will place the Torah in the ark, and it will be read publicly every 7 years. That was the 4th stage there in the middle. And so the book of Devarim is literally written in the way that these treaties were written. And that's so significant because we also know that we had to reestablish this covenant for the next generation. And while the covenant was established around Har Sinai and that experience, it has to be rewritten and reaccepted for the next generation. These covenants were never had power after one generation. And I just want to read one paragraph from Rabbi Sachs's introduction. And you can see it's on page 14 of his introduction. We now also understand the place of Deuteronomy in Tanakh as a whole. It is the axis on which all Jewish history turns. Had the generations that left Egypt had the faith and courage to enter the promised land, all Jewish history would turn on the revelation at Sinai. In fact, though, the episode of the spies showed that the generation lacked the spirit to do so. Therefore, the critical moment came for the next generation when Moshe, at the end of his life, renewed the covenant with them as the condition of their inheritance of the land. The 4 previous books of the Torah lead up to this moment, and all the other books of Tanakh are a commentary to it, an account of how it worked out in the course of time. And what's so significant for this also is that it connects to so many places in Torah where what God essentially wants is human partnership, is that he wants it to be a collaboration with us. And whether that's the Mishkan that is then destroyed and then is created with much more human initiative than the first one, we have multiple places, multiple great examples of where, God creates the world and wants us to be the ones that care for and till and develop the world. And so this actually, I think, will interestingly connect to today's conversation with my guest regarding this idea of kind of a chavruta, that God is an undeniable creator of the world, but ultimately he wants a partner. And we, of course, are meant to be that partner. Parshat Devarim opens with Moshe's historical overview of the desert sojourn, where he mentions events that reflect positively and negatively on the Israelites. He reviews the conquest of Sichon, the king of Amori, and Og, the king of Bashan. And this is all part of the historical prologue that we mentioned earlier in our introduction. My guest today is the amazing Rabbanit Nechama Goldman Barash. Nechama teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan and Pardes, as well as in Midrash Torah v'Avodah. She's an active member of Beit Hillel and a graduate of Matan's Hilchata program. For previous podcast episodes with Rabbanit Nechama, flip back to episodes 163, 109, 64, 46, and episode 4. There's a lot of great Torah there, and also one of the first episodes where we explored the writing process of a book that is now out, which is titled Uncovered: Women's Roles, Mitzvot, and Sexuality in Jewish Law. It's wonderful, and Nechama, I'm so happy you're here and so happy that we could say that at the opening of this episode.
Hi, Yosefa. Great to be here. And yes, what a relief to be able to say the book is finally out.
Yes, there's all different metaphors, right? Giving birth, marrying off a child, whatever the metaphor works, right? Thank God it's behind you.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, Nechama, as you know, this series, which you're opening with us, is going to be exploring the Torah that we've learned from different teachers of ours. But before we get to that space, and both you and I will share some personal stories about figures who have been influential on us, I just wanted to open up with a few ideas regarding Parshat Devarim itself. And really, while the historical prologue is very significant, I really just wanted to look for my first point at the opening psukim. אלה הדברים אשר דיבר משה אל כל ישראל בעבר הירדן, במדבר, בערבה, מול סוף, right? We have all these physical locales and the famous mysterious Di Zahav, the Chazal read as the site of the golden calf. These are the words that Moshe spoke to Bnei Israel at these locations. Particularly Pasuk Hey is what interests me. We have the locations of where Moshe is giving this big monumental address. בעבר הירדן בארץ מואב, הואיל משה באר את התורה הזאת לאמור. Okay, we have this idea of Moshe being the one who is be'er, who maybe it means to explain the Torah. And this phrase is really, really interesting. And it really opens up both that phrase and the previous phrase of all of the words that Hashem had told him. This main question of what is Sefer Devarim, right? Is it an autobiography of Moshe that he sort of makes up on his own? Is it some sort of document that he writes up and then Hashem sort of his divine editor and says, okay, go ahead, you could say all of that. Meaning, what does it mean? What of this is from Moshe? What of this is from God? And honestly, Nechama, it's not a question I was ever super interested in the past. And I don't know why I didn't think about it as much until the past few years. But there's really a whole gamut of opinions out there. And I will say that I know my audience always likes to hear about different books that might be relevant for them to learn or open up now. And I think that Micha Goodman's, while it's not a particularly rabbinic piece, but Haneum Ha'acharon Shel Moshe, which is also translated into English by Alana Kirshen, who's next week's guest. Moshe's, maybe its last address. I don't know what it's called in the translation. But his book actually does a great job. In the back, there's like an appendix, which sort of goes through all different opinions about how to understand Devarim, right? And he goes with the idea that it's really an autobiography, and that's sort of his piece. It's his contribution. He really develops that idea of why would all these ideas that he thinks are really Moshe's, why would he say them? But all I want to say here is that there is definitely a very individual contribution that Moshe makes to Torah, whether you think that God is his, gives his final approval, or that really just God lets him go forward and say what he wants to say. And then you go with sort of a Rabbi Tzadok opinion that this is the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's Moshe taking the Torah and then expounding it further. There's all different ways to look at it. But what I do want to say is that it also makes me think dramatically about what it means to teach. Because Moshe here becomes our teacher. He taught Am Yisrael laws here and there in the past, and he definitely was an adjudicator. But here he becomes a real teacher, right? That teacher stands up in front of them and gives long addresses. Right? Today it's almost going a little bit out of fashion, but right, this idea about teaching that it's this address. I have a Torah to give you. I have a programmatic statement I want to pass over. And the act of teaching is really a very varied one. And I think about this a lot in terms of what I'm trying to do. And I do different things in different scenarios. When I do podcasting, I feel like I'm much more midwifing Torah. When I stand up in front of a room, in another week, I'll be in the Yemei Yun and Tanakh, and my job is that I'm supposed to say something new. I think that's my job in the Yemei Yun. It stresses me out very much. But this question of what does it even mean to say something new? And I personally, and Nechama, I love to hear what you have to say about this. When I look at the phrase Be'eret HaTorah Hazot, to me, it always reminds me that a teacher of Judaism, whether it's whatever branch of that of the Torah it is, our job is to take some pre-existing system and make it relevant and understandable for the people that are in front of us. And there are those of us who will really be adding on a new line, not in the way that, let's say, Abaye and Rava were doing back then, but meaning we'll add on. But some of us are also just, our job is to make what was old become relevant for people. And they're all acts of teaching.
I want to go back to something you said about Devarim. I like Rabbi Tzadok's idea, and I like the Barbanel, who came obviously several hundred years before that, who also sees this as the words of Moshe that come from a deep intimacy and awareness of who God is in the world. And the idea, because I'm so enamored of and love rabbinic text and Talmud and the halachic process, the idea that Moshe is able to articulate into language and then into a legal framework, which we'll be talking about, which begins really or continues the idea of the word of God being interpreted into action. I think that's very profound. It's lo bashamayim hi, the idea of it is not in heaven, with Moshe as the conduit, as really the first person setting down that idea of the interpretation of God's word into something that can and must be applied. And then the idea that ultimately as teachers, what we do is we try to invite our students into, teachers of Torah text, into the text, into both learning the rules of text and the methodology and the language, and also finding themselves in a way that will be profoundly impactful on their lives, something they can apply into their lived experiences, and not just something that stays on the words of the page.
Yeah, I think also, I just want to bring in the words of Radat Hoffman. I can't go too many episodes in a row without bringing him in. He says that the word be'er means to peresh hirtza beverur, meaning he made something clearer. Or he says another interpretation is that it actually means to speak out loud. That the idea of Moshe speaking here is he's actually giving a speech, because you can explain something, you can explain it in writing. So he says the word be'er, according to the opinion he doesn't actually go with, is this idea of speaking it out loud. And he brings in another example from Chavakuk, where he thinks be'er actually means to dig deep. And in that, that's, he says, more fitting with the idea of writing. But again, I just want to bring out this idea that teaching happens through multiple mediums. We have the writing medium that obviously you've just spent a long time in a particularly intense way. And we also have the speaking medium. And I'll just say, for those of us who are also in the teaching world, we all live with attention inside of us. If we're those who have the ability to write, some people just don't feel like that's at all their kli, that it's a tension between, how much do you dedicate to teaching, how much you dedicate to writing. And as someone I deeply respect recently said, they're not aware of any idea for a book that ever came from somewhere else except from teaching in a classroom. Meaning you need the classroom, you need the lived experience, you need the Torah dynamic in order for good ideas to come about into the world. I know this happens for me all the time. I can come in with a lesson plan that's, I don't know, it's all right. Meaning, and I think it's decently planned, but in a good classroom, I rely on the dynamic in the classroom to be able to bring other things to life. And I think that that's also a big piece.
Absolutely. And I just want to interject and say that often the first time I teach new material, it's actually quite frightening because
Yes.
I haven't fully articulated it or see how it's going to land. And, I said to you that the reason it took so long for the book to come out is the ideas didn't profoundly change in any way. They're still the ideas I started off with 6 years ago. But the way I presented them, the need to go over them over and over, make them clearer, figure out how they were going to be articulated, and so on, that was what took so much time. And the same thing happens in the classroom. Often the first time I teach a class, it's rougher, it's not as polished. I'm developing ideas with my students. And what I often find most daunting is where there is silence, where I go in to teach and I really like the interaction. And occasionally I'll walk into a new space and the students don't know they're allowed to do that. That they don't recognize that I really want this to be a chavruta, that that's what Torah text is about. It's not just a frontal lecture, which I know how to do. But when I walk in thinking it's going to be a chavruta and it turns into a frontal lecture, I often find the silence of the students difficult. It's like there's silence around the text and it's just my voice. And I really want to open it up and be in dialogue and conversation with my students and hear what they have to say, because that allows me then to go deeper with what I'm trying to say. And so that elu devarim, right, this idea of words, of language, particularly when it comes to Torah study, is very, very central to our internalizing the words of the text.
So I will just say that, Nechama, if you never want to be scared again, teach in Hebrew to Israeli audiences, because they always assume it's a chavruta, even if you wanted to come in and give a frontal lecture. So don't worry.
Yes, I've done
it only
that
happens
well.
in English-speaking audiences where people are quiet. So yes. I could solve that problem for you. But I just wanted to add one piece. I think it really dovetails what you said, which is that the word, the root, this I learned from Rabbi Sachs, the root like lamed mem daled of lamad or lamed really appears 17 times in Devarim, but nowhere else in the Torah. Meaning he really brings up this point that Moshe highlights a different aspect of Torah, which is that you have to teach it. And he specifically speaks about, in 4 places in Devarim where Moshe charges the people with, you have to teach this forward. And that's also a profound idea, meaning it's not just that Moshe is teaching, but Moshe is also teaching the Am, that you have to essentially become educators. And while we think about that more specifically on Seder night, it's obviously not just limited to Leila Seder. It's really all year round.
So I'm going to dovetail on that and say that I had not realized the root lamed mem daled appears 17 times, but I do know that the pasuk v'limadetem otam et bnechem appears in the book of Devarim, and you shall teach it to your children, really your sons, literally. And I just finished teaching Kiddushin this summer, parts of Kiddushin in the Pardes program, and we spent quite a bit of time on that midrash v'limadetem otam et bnechem. First of all, the primary drasha there is you shall teach it to your sons because you have an obligation to learn it yourself. So a lovely play on words of lamed mem daled as both teach and learn. Mm-hmm. And those who have to learn have to teach, particularly in the parent-child relationship. And of course, what is painful for me as a woman, although I'll get to the more modern development, is it says v'lo benotechem, et bnechem v'lo benotechem, you shall teach your sons and not your daughters. And that at that stage in the development of teaching, sons were very much obligated. Daughters were not prohibited. They were excluded. They were exempt. And it's lovely that in the 20th century, that verse has been re-understood to very much include all children as a necessary the necessary model for how to pass on a lived life of Torah, that there has to be learning and teaching, first in the parent-child relationship, and then outward-facing in school and in Beit Midrash and in Midrashah and all those places we go to continue studying, but first and foremost between parent and child. What I love about Sefer Devarim, in addition to Moshe really bringing his heart and soul into the speeches he is leaving behind as his legacy, is that there's something very intentional about the almost 200 mitzvot. I think it's 199 mitzvot that appear in Devarim. It's an enormous amount, and many of them are new. Some of them are reformulations from Shemot. But really the sense you get is the essence of a framework of law in crafting our relationship not only with God, but very much with one another. The Ben Adam L'Chaveiro piece is very, very strong here. And because I teach Kitetse a lot, I'm very sensitive to the place in which legal formulation, some sort of structured, intentional law, is presented in areas in which we're not always looking or assuming it will exist in. And I think of war, because here we are in war right now, and Matan just finished their program on war and peace. And I gave a 3-part series on the beautiful captive woman. But before we got into the beautiful captive woman, and I'll say a few words, and I think we did a podcast on it back a number of years ago, is that I introduced all of the places in Devarim where war appears, and the minute way in which the law looks at behavior during war, down to how do we go to the bathroom, how do we take care of our waste. And there's something so broad in how Moshe understands the human body, the human experience, the ability for the physical to be elevated at moments of complete, I would even say, degradation, if I might. The idea that the bathroom is such a physical experience, and yet even at war, where we're at our most primal, we have to think about our behavior as that physical essence. We can't just sink into the animal, into the animalistic side of ourselves. And that brings me to the captive woman, the idea that women will be taken in captivity. And I don't see it just as a concession to the Yetzer Hara, which is a later midrashic idea, but it's more of a full-on awareness of what the human experience is going to elicit at these moments. And this repeats itself throughout relationships with women in Devarim, whether it's divorce, whether it's falsely accusing the virgin, whether it's rape. It's not that the Torah is validating these behaviors, but it is responding to the reality of these experiences and saying there is no place in which God's word or divine law or human interpretation of the divine is not relevant and is not present. And I find that to be a continuous, theme within Sefer Devarim. It's setting up Shotrim and Shoftim and Shotrim. You need judges. You need police officers. You need the king. One model of leadership is not going to be enough for you. There has to be different types of leadership. There has to be the elders at the gate when you have a child who is rebellious. Throughout the book, there really are layers and layers of depth in terms of where law can and should and must meet us. But it's not just law in the secular sense. There's something in the awareness that it's a profoundly religious experience as well to be setting up a framework of law.
Yeah, I think that point is so critical because we have many laws throughout the earlier books of the Torah, but Sefer Devarim has a particular focus, as you said, on creating a society that is bound by religious law, by halakha. And as you said, so many laws that appear here that don't appear anywhere else. And so there's, it's also, well, of course, God is very much present, and we're aware of the fact that this is part of a divine system. The laws that we have in the book of Devarim much more reflect kind of this idea of a democratic world, meaning also because of the fact that the king is so minor, right, and almost non-existent and so limited. This idea that all these laws that I have given to you in a theoretical sense are meant to be able to self-control society. Now, of course, in reality, that's not exactly what happens. But the way that Devarim really sets up society is for that kind of success, is that if we follow these laws, we'll govern wartime, we'll govern our daily, judicial needs, and we'll also govern our interactions between society and, of course, also with God. And so in theory, we're supposed to be set up for success, that we could be a society that succeeds by following this system. Obviously, history has taught us that we weren't always able to live up to that aspiration, but it's very much there as the system that's set out in the book of Devarim. I just wanted to make one point about what you said about war and about these laws, which is that I was just at a Yom Iyun for Yoatzot Halacha a few days ago, and that this was brought up in a long conversation about different halachic concessions that have been discussed and made also in the past few months. And one of the Rabbanim that was on the panel there, he basically said, similar to what you just said about Moshe, but about the Rambam. So of course also the famous phrase, right? Lo kam Moshe ad Moshe, and this idea that he said, if you read through Hilchot Milchama of the Rambam, he said, I do not understand how the Rambam so deeply understood the mind frame of a man at war, because that did not describe his experience. But he said that he really gets to the crux of it. And I think that what you're saying is really the root of it. I mean, it's because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who really understood that. And the Rambam is expounding upon those rules. And this piece specifically about sexual needs during a time of war, right? There's an insane amount of adrenaline also that people are experiencing. And this was also something that came up in all different contexts in halacha questions that came up this year. They impact different, people differently depending on what they're doing at wartime. But we've seen very real practical implications of a lot of these dilemmas in the past few months, with the own particular circumstances of this war and the way that people were serving and going in and out at different times. Nechama, I would like to ask you, because this series really we're focusing on people who have taught us and who have been significant in our derech halimud, or perhaps also just your worldview or who you are as a person. And I'm curious to hear about some of those people that have influenced you, in whatever realm of Torah life it's been.
So I want to acknowledge the incredible impact my parents and grandparents' Torah had on my life, although I'm not going to highlight anything particular. But I have a vivid memory of my mother saying Shema with me at night before going to bed, and Moda Ani with me when I woke up in the morning. And learning on Shabbat, I have to admit I didn't love it as a child, but I recognized the importance of it, even as I found it somewhat painful. To be sitting, when all my friends were playing and having to learn some Torah, and it must have impacted me because I ended up going into that field.
This is helpful for you to tell me this right now. Thank you, Nechama. You did not know that was important for me to hear as a mother. I'm in that moment right now, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, but I want to highlight two pieces of Torah that I learned specifically from teachers of mine. I will say they're both men, and that, of course, has changed over the years. I now have wonderful teachers and colleagues who are women, but I'm going back to a very early stage in my study of Torah more seriously. I'm going to go back to Stern College in the late 1980s, and I'm going to highlight two teachers. And one of them is Rabbi Moshe Khan, and I want to bring him first because it ties into Sefer Devarim more directly. I remember learning Sefer Devarim Sanhedrin, Masechet Sanhedrin, with Rabbi Khan. And I remember that we were learning about the Rodef. And of course, the Rodef, the pursuer, is Sefer Shmot. But the topic we were learning was rape. And that is more Sefer Devarim. And one of the things that comes out in the Gemara is whether you can kill a Rodef who's about to commit a sin, not just of murder, but of the rape of a married woman. And that's considered to be adultery, and it's a capital crime. And I remember that we talked about the distinction in the Gemara. It wasn't personal. It was a completely limudi experience, right? It was just purely Talmudic study. And the distinction between raping a married woman, which was a capital crime, for which you would kill the rodef, you would kill the pursuer as he was in pursuit of carrying out this action, but you would not kill the pursuer if he was going to rape an unmarried woman, because that's not a capital crime. And I think that was the first time that I really found the ability to begin to articulate my deep discomfort with such a distinction. Rape is rape, and it's a violent crime, not just a sexual crime that is about which is more, for which is one more liable in halacha. And I remember the conversation we had with Rabbi Khan, and I remember how respectful he was and how much he listened, and that he was in chavruta with us, and he allowed us to express our concern that, or our sense that the rabbis were not thinking about the violence of the crime. They were compartmentalizing based on halachic liability, and we went into all sorts of different directions with it. That's not the point to go start doing a limud of that sugya. But I do remember that conversation that then led to my spending the next 15, 20 years going back to the Masechtot, the tractates, in which conversations about women appeared, and trying to find myself and trying to understand better how Chazal were perceiving women, and then adding my own voice as to how the perception of women, from the perception of women, my own perception of the text, of the sugya, teaching it, learning it, going back to it, trying to understand it better, and feeling finally that women's voices were being heard within these texts about women. And I really can point to that class in that moment. It was probably 1988, 89, that I began a process of deep both respect and critique of the Talmudic conversation, and really wanting to find myself in that conversation. He was the first person who invited me into the text, I think.
You know, Nechama, I also was a student of Rabbi Khan, and for those who don't know who he was, he passed away a little over a year ago, I believe, right? And he was probably the quietest revolutionary of women's Torah learning in America. And anybody who was his student, he loomed large, specifically in that way, in such a quiet but such a sharp thinker. He demanded utter excellence from his students, and he took us seriously. So I wasn't as serious of a Gemara woman as you were. I took him for a few semesters, but I actually took his halacha classes much more, and those were also profoundly influential on how I learn and think about halacha. So I'm just going to read something that very brief that I had written about him. I also was his student, but he's not one of my people that I brought, but I'm going to read it. So many moving posts have already been written about Rabbi Moshe Khan, who passed away last week, and who was most likely, right after Rav Soloveitchik, the man most responsible for American women's Talmudic literacy. For over 40 years, he taught Talmud and Halakha at Stern College and the Drisha Institute, touching the minds and hearts of almost every Anglo woman I know who teaches and learns Torah today. I was most moved by the fact that almost every post enumerated the same strengths of his as a teacher, the strongest sign of a clear legacy of methodology. In a world sorely lacking in long-haul approaches, Rabbi Khan was its epitome. He taught us to never cut corners, that we were never too old for an Aramaic vocabulary quiz, and that one should only speak if they were properly prepared to do so. The most unbelievable part is that he didn't convey this tough love approach by speaking harshly. He was a gentle man who only expressed frustration by readjusting his kippah and re-explaining his position. His standards pushed us to our limits, and we deeply respected him for demanding excellence. He was the quintessential mensch who answered every question with patience, whether in the classroom or in the Beit Midrash. Being a student for 3 years provided my clearest experience of being part of a living tradition. This is why I thought of this piece when you were speaking. That being said, this past week I have found myself reflecting on a wholly different element of Rabbi Khan's legacy. I grew into religious maturity in several contexts that rarely discussed ideology or gender. These were words that simply didn't make their way into conscious discussion, or if they did, I didn't hear them. One of the ways this was accomplished was through each institution's emphasis on Torah literacy. You're a Jew, with cognitive capabilities, you should be learning Torah. And you should be learning Torah as much as possible. I can only attest to then, 18 years ago, my identity as a woman seemed utterly uninteresting. I wasn't treated differently. Hard work and Torah excellence was expected of me, and wow, was I thirsty. I kept thinking of this in the context of Rabbi Kahn's classes. I imagine others had more straightforward conversations, like you, Nechama, with him about matters of women and Judaism. I didn't, but he was not an ideological man when it came to these topics. In his classroom, we were simply humans trying our best to respect, understand, and learn our divine tradition. This, I think, is the reason why I never noticed anything revolutionary about how we were being taught. I had to understand every line in the Rishonim because there was no reason for me not to. Torah was given to us humans, and all of us at Stern College were humans endowed with a multitude of capabilities. Rabbi Kahn and so many other beloved teachers of mine taught me, without naming or blaming, that in the eyes and image of God, we are all capable of contributing to our living tradition. I just thought about that piece that I had written right after he passed away, Nechama, because I think that, you were gifted that you were able to have those conversations with him. I wasn't as intellectually mature as you was, I guess, at that point. But I think also just the way he taught us, that was just do your best. Darn it, you have no reason not to do your best, was profoundly influential for many of us.
Yeah, that was very impactful. The idea that we could have a conversation around the text, and I really grew up, in the 80s, in very mediocre day school education, like I would say sub-mediocre maybe. There was no interest in the day schools I went to in opening up conversations or demanding excellence or anything of that nature. There were a few exceptions here and there, but largely Torah classes had to be born and we had to get through, and we understood that we were in religious schools and that's what we did. But there was nothing exciting or inspiring about those classes. And that was transformative. But I spent a year at Michlala, so I do want to give credit to that year as being transformative. And for that reason, I was ready for Rabbi Kahn's class when I came back. This idea of being open to being pushed, to being more was demanded of me when I entered a class rather than just a frontal, let's learn, let me drone on about Sefer Shemot and just tell you what Rashi says. And that's it. Like suddenly there were these unexplored vistas that I was being invited to explore. And as you said so beautifully, the demand for not cutting corners, for excellence, for really owning the text, but first and foremost as a text before beginning conversations about it. So the second example I want to bring is Rabbi Dr. Saul Berman. He was also my teacher at Stern. And the class I want to focus on is medical ethics. It was a class that really combined my love for medicine because like many women of my generation, many of my friends were pre-med and almost none of us actually became doctors. Many of us went into teaching Torah. But it was, at that point, I was very, very interested in medicine. And here he brought together the intersectionality of medicine and halacha. And I still have my notes from that class. And I remember we studied abortion, birth control, fertility treatment, euthanasia, end of life, organ donation, all the topics that continue to be relevant today. And I see that as planting a seed for what later became my direction into becoming a yoetzet, and now I'm finishing a 2-year course on fertility and halacha. And I think what he allowed me to realize within myself is I didn't need to become a doctor to fulfill my interest in medicine. I could actually find it equally, if not more meaningful, to bring together my love for halacha and medicine.
So it's interesting, Nechama, because, there are a few years between us, but I took the same classes. So yeah. At the risk of repeating, I was in those classes as well. And, I think back and I think to myself, and I say that kind of sadly, my girls won't have that education. Like it doesn't exist in the same way in Israel. There's a lot of other amazing things about living in Israel, and I'm very happy that I live here. But that kind of education that I had is pretty unique. I think it's even unique now because I don't necessarily know if it exists in the same way, at the same intensity as we experienced it. But what's also funny and obviously boring about us is that I also, like a good, intelligent Jewish woman, was originally pre-med and ultimately ended up going to teach Torah. And all my friends all became doctors. So that's the one difference of our story. I'm the only one who teaches Torah. But the truth is that I also just wanted to bring in, and what's interesting is, as I was also thinking back, I was thinking about the fact that what it means to have a teacher is so varied. Meaning there are people who have been profoundly influential in what I really do every day now, but I never met them. Meaning there are people who influence me through their writing or their approaches to different Torah elements. But when I think back to like the meeting with a teacher, I also think back to those formative years where I first was learning seriously. And I think that's part of it. It's not just, it's not that people later weren't significant, but in those early years where you're first like discovering the world of learning Torah, which for a lot of us women was 18 to let's say 21, then those are really powerful experiences because they're your first experiences. And I wonder, I'm curious, even if there was like a study done, for men who have, more serious Torah learning from a young age, would more of them say like their high school Rebbe? I mean, there's something about that original really moving experience. And the truth is that for me, I thought of three people that were physically my teachers who most influenced me, meaning I met them in a classroom. And they're also all men. But I actually don't want to apologize here in regards to the fact that, there weren't as many women, because the truth is that I had female teachers. But for me, I know that it's a personality thing. And I thought really of two people also from Stern, which it's interesting. I actually really didn't want to be in the States at that point. I really wanted to try to make Aliyah. My parents wanted me to stay in America. And it ended up being that my education that I got in those 3 years was really, really profound. And I'm always so grateful that I stayed in the States for those 3 years, even though I wasn't happy necessarily outside of that framework. And I thought of two people that it was more about their approach to learning than what they taught me that were impactful. And that was Rabbi J.J. Schachter, who never knew me personally, really, and Rabbi Ephraim Kanner-Fogel. And why were they so impactful for me? Because they were the first, I had this sense, even though I couldn't articulate it yet, that I was highly attracted to Torah learning that was also academic. And they were like the first figures that I saw in my life that combined both, I thought, like serious religious piety, like these were Rabbanei Kehillah, they had shuls and more, and also serious academics. And those they were models that, whether consciously or not, I really held up in my mind. Rabbi J.J. Schachter was also the most charismatic teacher that I met, I think, in those earlier years. I mean, I was in a lecture with like 60 young women. He never knew me. We never had a personal relationship. Years later, I actually tried to get him on the podcast a few times, which hasn't succeeded up until now. And we've had a little bit more of personal interaction, but he didn't know me. This wasn't like a meaningful relationship on a personal level, but they were this idea that I held up of that, like I could also be interested in academia and want things to be at a high level and involve those approaches and also hold my like Yahadut and my halachic observance and my relationship with God very close to me.
There are actually three women I want to highlight because I think it's important as I go back to recognize that the impact certain female teachers had. One is Nechama Leibovich, who I actually only heard teach once, but I grew up sharing her name and having her books in my house. And that also was very impactful. I gave my bat mitzvah drasha based on her Torah. So she was present. My mother actually studied with her for a year and kept begging me to come to the classes, but I was too busy dating my husband, I have to be honest, and then I never had another opportunity. The other two, on a much more personal level, Dr. Brian Levy, did exactly what you were describing. Here she was, academic and passionate and so methodological, right? Like everything about her Tanakh class was about really the rules for learning text. I remember she mentioned the Anchor Bible to us, which I had never heard of, the BDB, and the methodology of the medievalists. And so she was very important in my seeing how intellectual and yet very devout a woman could be in Torah study. And she was quite young at the time, so she was having children and seeing what it looked like to run a family and still pursue an academic career in Torah. And the second was Dina Wienerpack, who is now Dina Wiener-Kahn, I believe. But she was my teacher. She wasn't much older than me when she was at Stern, and I was really a groupie. She was young and she was vibrant, and I could see myself in her. And it was a continuation of Brina's class in Michlala into Stern, and this idea of the youthful vibrancy and passionate intellect of Dina in Stern also
pushed me forward. So it was really a very seminal time, the period from 18 to 21, where I was being exposed to new models of Torah study, which is why I go back to them, because that led me to Matan and then to Nishmat and then to a master's in Talmud. But it all really started because of a fertile ground, this fertile place where seeds were being planted by both men and women who were pushing my own personal journey forward.
Yeah, and the one figure that I want to just add to that is, for me, was Professor, he's also a rabbi, Eliasis, who, for me, I mean, he literally guided me through a decade of my life. And I actually spoke to him this past week. I met him when I went to Herzog, the year I made Aliyah, and he was so kind. And so we spoke, and then he said, I teach in this place called Matan, and I think you'd really like it there. And so he brought me to the master's program in Tanakh and Parshanut in Matan. And then the program was done in conjunction with Bar Ilan, where he was also at that point the head of the department. And so I did my master's degree also mostly in his classes in Bar Ilan. And then he got me my first job in his wife's high school the year after that. And then I decided that really I don't really want to teach high school. And then I ended up writing a doctorate, and he was my advisor for the next 5 years. So I bring him up not even just because technically, he was literally brought me from place to place for a whole bunch of years, but also because he was another example of someone who combined serious scholarship with a seriously frum lifestyle. And that for me was continually, because as I got older and started foraying into more serious academic things that are just they jive less well with a lot of classical opinions, that became even more important for me as I was sort of building up a worldview, to be able to have that feeling that I had someone there to guide me who was many decades ahead of me, but was still living, the lifestyle that I was looking to live. So that was really important. I also just want to give a shout out because he just put out a new book through Koren, which really also typifies his approach that I learned from him all those years. So much of what you see happening, whether it's on the podcast or another shiurim I give, it's very much influenced by Eli, ultimately at a lot of its root. But he put out a book called Torah Kipshuta, where he's going to eventually put out on all of Torah, but right now he put out on Sefer Bamidbar. So those are some also that were really influential. But I do want to say, Nechama, because I think it also is coming through in what you're saying, which is this idea that for those of us who continue in the world of learning and teaching, I know for me, it's been essential to consistently find new sources or new teachers, in air quotes, meaning I'm not physically in their classroom, unfortunately, but they're people that I learn a lot from in their approach, because if we want to keep growing and getting better and really honing in our profession, we have to continually find active models in order for that to work well and to be fruitful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think this has been so wonderful to be able to, it's always wonderful to talk Torah with you, Yosefa, but to think about the people who inspired us, and the lists really are much longer than either of us have presented, but really from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, from those teachers that sparked the interest to the teachers who encouraged us and pushed us forward. Really, we say it takes a village. It's very cliche, but it's really, really true. And then, of course, the flip side is, unfortunately, the teacher who pushes the child away, the teacher who, instead of inspiring, humiliates or denigrates or uninspires. And we come back maybe to that starting point, the fragility, the real responsibility that the teacher has in the classroom, what it means to, and not just in the classroom, a Torah shir we give, a podcast we give, the idea of wanting to, wanting people to respond or find the Torah we teach resonant, and certainly, lo aleinu, God forbid, we don't want it to alienate or push away. And I feel that responsibility very strongly when I walk into a classroom. And when a class doesn't go well, or when I've said something that every so often you realize, oh, do no harm. Wait, did I do some harm there? Did I touch on a topic that was too personal? Did I open up something that was too raw for a student through my teaching Torah? That incredible awareness that there's nothing neutral about the material that we teach. It's very much a living Torah, and people are complex, and what they bring in when they come into the classroom, when they come and learn, whether they're 16 or 18 or 50 or 60, I think we all talk about these life experiences, marriage and divorce and death and fertility. They're all very redolent in the Torah text, and we don't always know where people are coming from. When we talk, even I mentioned almost casually the idea of rape in the Talmud. I don't know if there is a young man or woman sitting in the audience who has undergone some sort of sexual assault.
Yeah, today someone would think very carefully before opening up that sugya. So it's a little bit different than it was then, but yeah.
Absolutely. Or fertility. Is someone struggling with infertility? When I come in all excited to teach about third-party reproduction, or when we talk about euthanasia, is someone struggling with end-of-life questions? And that's what makes it so different, perhaps, than teaching poetry or political science. These are topics that are very much about us and our lives and meet us wherever we are.
Nechama, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I really appreciate you making time during your vacation to be able to talk to us. So thank you so much.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.